For Iran, this war is a fight for sheer survival. War is an excellent business, but only for a few.
Are we seeing the beginning of a century of new wars because of that?
I assume this warlike phase marks the end, meaning the two of us won't live to see it. It's going to take decades.
Gegen den Strom. Zur Person.
Hello, and welcome to Against the Current. We present positions and perspectives that the propaganda media keep hidden. Anyone who wants to understand geopolitical issues today would do well to leave the traditional media behind and turn to the online publication Forum Geopolitica. There you'll find analyses, the underlying interests, and the geopolitical connections you won't read about in the newspapers. The publisher behind it is Dr. Peter Hänseler, a successful lawyer who has now moved into journalism. Hello, Dr. Hänseler. You discuss questions of geopolitics, questions about Iran. How successful is the magazine?
Yes, our reach is growing. We're getting more and more readers. What really surprised me was when I looked at the analytics recently, we're being read more and more in China. Our blog is published in German, Russian, English, and French. We have about 20 authors. I started this blog in November of 2022 because Swiss media outlets were publishing me less and less. My positions probably didn't align with those in the West. At first, I wrote one article a week by myself, and then it just grew from there. We're very happy with how successful it's become. And it's definitely not just me. August Maxim, who also lives here in Moscow, is more or less the editor-in-chief. I'm 62, and he's about half my age. We have contributors from Germany, France, Spain, the United States, Scott Ritter, for example. A lot of authors who bring in many different perspectives on geopolitics.
Unlike in the United States, the United Kingdom, China, or Russia, there's very little interest in geopolitical issues in Central Europe, especially in Germany. Can you explain why that is?
I think people are mostly caught up with themselves. That's the first problem. The second problem is that especially in Germany and Switzerland, people still trust outlets like the Tagesschau, the FAZ, the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, and all the others. We need to be clear about that. I used to work 100 hours a week, and when I spent an hour a day reading 2 or 3 newspapers, I also thought I was well informed. A big part of my work is reading. So, I get up at 5 in the morning and start by reading for about 3 hours. Then I write for a while, and after that, I read again. I probably read 10 to 12 hours a day. And it's really difficult. The internet has an enormous amount of information, but there's also a lot of junk out there. So it's not like everything that calls itself an alternative medium is automatically good. That means when you come across a new source, you have to follow it for a while. I usually read it for 2 or 3 weeks, and then step by step, you figure out whether it's reliable or not. In short, gathering information has become extremely difficult.
How do you find your sources?
Yeah, through surfing, through X, through Telegram. Then there are sources I know well, with authors I correspond with or talk to. We exchange ideas, and then someone says, hey, take a look at this and check that out. It just takes a lot of time. It really does. It's not rocket science to stay well informed, but it is time-consuming.
But you also find sources in the real world, right? Yes, of course. You're not just an analyst. In a way, you're also a witness to history, at least since the illegal attack by the United States and Israel on Iraq. When the war began, you were in Dubai and got stuck there.
What did I experience? Well, it was actually kind of funny. About 10 days, or maybe 6 days before the war broke out, I wrote an article about the tense situation. I concluded that the war wouldn't start because the balance of power didn't allow for it, and the Americans wouldn't make such a crazy decision. Then Scott Ritter called me and said, "You're wrong." I think 2 days before the war began, he wrote an article saying it would start. I thought he was wrong, but it turned out I was the one who was wrong. And on the morning of February 28th, I heard the planes, and then the explosions started.
Habe ich Flugzeuge gehört und das hat geknallt. Und das war also nicht, es war keine Katastrophe, wir waren nicht.
But it wasn't a catastrophe, and we weren't afraid. Then a lot of people started to panic, and they fled overland through Oman and Saudi Arabia. Our flights were canceled, and at that point I was absolutely convinced, while I was in Dubai, that they would definitely bomb the center of Dubai. And I turned out to be right. We were stuck there for 10 days because of the situation, but after that, we were able to leave without any problems. I know people who are now going back to Dubai. I have close friends there. Simon Hunt, one of our authors, lives in Dubai. He's already made some preparations in case he has to leave the country. He'd go to Thailand.
Würde dann nach Thailand reisen. Die Situation in Dubai zum heutigen Zeitpunkt.
Right now, the situation in Dubai is that it's basically empty. That huge tourism and airport machine is running at maybe 10 or 12%. They're losing hundreds of millions of dollars every single day. So it's really a tough situation. Most of the migrant workers there are in a difficult spot. They come from very poor countries, and when the work disappears, they're simply sent home. Simon Hunt told me that his taxi driver, someone he's known and relied on for years, used to make between 900 and 1,200 dirhams a day. Now it's down to about 200, and you just can't survive on that.
Und jetzt sind es noch 200 und mit dem kann man einfach nicht überleben.
When you and your family were caught off guard by the war in Dubai, in a city under attack, what was going through your mind?
Yes, I was responsible for the family, so I had to stay calm.
A calm you didn't feel inside.
Oh, yes, absolutely. When things get serious, I'm strangely always very calm. I actually get more nervous about small things, like when the coffee's late. But no, that really wasn't a big problem for me. And of course, there's the sense of responsibility. I was there with my wife, her sister, her son, and one of his school friends. They were supposed to be back in school on Monday, but they were completely thrilled. It was a nice hotel, it felt like a vacation, so calming the kids wasn't hard at all. When we finally left, they were actually disappointed. And then, suddenly, the hotel staff started to panic.
Als es dann, man hat natürlich Explosionen gehört und dann hat man auf dem Handy.
Of course, you could hear explosions, and then bomb alerts started popping up on our phones. I think it was the second or maybe the third night when we were woken up. They told us we all had to go down to the lobby, and then we were directed to the underground parking garage. I said, "I'm not doing that." So we went back to sleep. The next morning, you could tell right away who had spent the night in the garage and who had stayed in their hotel room. People definitely overreacted. I mean, I didn't think the city center would be attacked. But later, a hotel where American soldiers were staying was actually hit.
Das wurde angegriffen. Und irgendein
And some Mossad office, that was the only thing in the city center that got attacked. So yeah, I didn't think it was that crazy. I wasn't terrified for my life or anything. How long were we stuck there? I think we had to stay about 10 days. And life goes on. You just have to accept a certain fatalism in life. How did we get out? By plane, just normally. We had a lady at the concierge desk, and I simply said, "Could you please arrange the next flight for all of us?" And that worked out. So we flew home with the regular airline, no extra charge.
Ohne Ticketaufschlag sind wir wieder nach Hause gekommen.
You mentioned earlier that Dubai in particular was hit much harder by that shelling than what we've seen in the media here. How did that become noticeable?
Wenn man die Zahlen anschaut, wurde Dubai.
If you look at the numbers, Dubai was hit harder by Iranian attacks than the other Emirates. That's obviously connected to the fact that the Emirates have taken and still take a more aggressive stance toward Iran. It's a logical consequence.
What are the effects of the shelling? What's being hit?
American military installations were hit, as well as oil facilities. But they're too far out to really see anything.
Why has Dubai acted more aggressively toward Iran than other neighboring states?
That's a good question. All the Gulf states are opportunists. And we'll also see that the rest of the world, most of them really, are opportunists too. They thought the Iranians were going to lose, so they took a stand against them. But now we can see that Oman acted very wisely. They weren't attacked by the Iranians. And it turned out that the countries working most closely with the Americans, especially those with bases from which Iran was attacked the most. And that was easy for the Iranians to figure out. Those countries were hit the hardest.
When Iran attacks military bases, but also oil and gas production and processing facilities, what's the strategy behind that?
A consistent response. Now we need to take 2 steps back. For Iran, this war is a fight for sheer survival, and it's always been the case that the Israelis and the Americans escalated first and the Iranians followed. At the first stage, American military installations were attacked, not oil facilities. And when Iran's oil infrastructure was hit, the Iranians responded in kind. The next stage, whether it happens or not, we don't know, would come if the desalination plants, without which these countries can't survive, were attacked in Iran, or if there were another strike. In that case, Iran has indicated that it would more or less bomb everything and strip those countries of their economic foundation. People also have the wrong idea about the size and strength of Iran. And what really surprised me, and that's why I was mistaken, I thought people would still think rationally in the end. Iran is a huge country, about 1.5 million square kilometers. Western Europe is around 1.3 million. That makes Iran more than 70 times larger than Israel. And when you bomb a country that big, the impact is obviously small compared to what happens if they strike back at a target area that's more than 70 times smaller. That's the first point.
Kleiner ist. Das ist der erste Punkt. Der zweite Punkt ist, dass
The second point is that Iranians, and we both grew up with this, we're about the same age, were always portrayed as the bad guys. The mullahs, some kind of religious fanatics or fools living back in the 14th century. I've been to Iran twice, and honestly, that was the biggest culture shock I've ever had. I went there with a positive attitude, but I was absolutely amazed by the level of education. When you talk to people, they're not Arabs, they're Persians, and that's a huge difference. The level of education is extremely high.
Bildung ist extrem hoch. Viele Leute sprechen hervorragend Englisch.
A lot of people there speak excellent English, excellent French. Last year, Iran graduated about the same number of engineers from its universities as the United States did, over 240,000 people. And by last June, it should have been clear how far along the Iranians are with their military technology. Their technology is at the highest level, not just high, but the highest. When you talk to experts, they'll tell you their rocket technology is about 10 years ahead of the Americans. Their missiles are on par with the Russian and Chinese ones.
Den chinesischen in nichts nach. Und das ist selber entwickelt und selber produziert.
And that's developed and produced by themselves. On top of that, all those rocket bases, we're talking about entire cities underground, and they're not just 30 or 40 meters below the surface where a bunker buster could reach them. They're buried under 800 meters of granite. Over the past 25 years, they've prepared specifically for this scenario, and they've done it very intelligently. The strikes by the Americans and the Israelis, especially that girls' school, where 165 girls were killed, that's absolutely brutal. And more than 80 hospitals have been attacked.
Spitäler angegriffen. Also mit der heutigen Intelligenz der Systeme.
Given the level of intelligence these systems have today, I have to assume it was intentional, because the military targets are basically untouchable. Now, the death toll is around 3,000 civilians. That's brutal, and it's horrific. But we're talking about 92 million people. So statistically speaking, in relative terms, that's almost nothing. On the other hand, and this is becoming increasingly clear, Tel Aviv and Haifa were hit extremely hard. That was actually the reason a ceasefire was declared last summer. But obviously, they haven't learned anything from it. I don't believe Iran can be defeated.
The image that Western European propaganda creates of Iran is something like a mix between camel drivers and Lawrence of Arabia. Did the two aggressors miscalculate? Completely, yes. Why?
Well, so, I met a lot of people when I was in Iran from all parts of society. I was invited there 5 times, and I'm really not a religious person, even though I come from a very religious family. The second time, my wife came with me, and we had 5 incredibly fun and beautiful evenings. I was allowed to ask anything I wanted, and I did. These were highly educated people. And every Iranian I spoke with basically asked me, how would you describe yourself?
Wie würden Sie sich selbst beschreiben? Da sagt immer, ich bin ein Drittel Muslim, ein Drittel.
He always says, I'm 1/3 Muslim, 1/3 Persian, and 1/3 a person oriented toward the West. That means religion is present, it matters, but it only defines about 1/3 of society. In Israel, that's completely different. There you have religious fanatics, and here you don't. And there are, I think, around 30 or 40,000 Jews living in Iran, and they even have representation in parliament. They don't have any problems at all. There are Christians there too. No issue. So I didn't sense any kind of fanaticism. In fact, they're probably the friendliest people I've ever met.
Who are the barbarians in this war?
Also die größten Barbaren sind die Israelis.
So, the biggest barbarians are the Israelis. And that's not just clear from the way they're waging war against Iran. You can see it in how these people are behaving in Gaza, in the West Bank, and now in Lebanon. This is genocide. And in terms of brutality and methods, what they're doing, in my opinion, is identical to what the Nazis did in the 1940s.
In den 40er Jahren.
Der US-amerikanische Politikwissenschaftler
The American political scientist John J. Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago suspects that Netanyahu made it clear to Trump that the window for an attack on Iran is closing. Does that match your impression?
Deckt sich das mit Ihrem Eindruck?
Ja, es ist ja vor dem ersten.
Yes, that was before the first attack. It came out later, and Mearsheimer and Larry Johnson confirmed it, that the Pentagon leadership had made it clear to him that it was pointless, that it wouldn't succeed. But Trump listened to Netanyahu and Hegseth, who were pushing for it. And now we're in a similar situation again. People are talking about a ceasefire, but it's not a ceasefire in the legal sense, because only the Iranians and the Americans have stopped shooting. The Americans are violating that truce through the naval blockade, because that's an act of war under international law.
Act of war nach internationalem Recht, aber internationales Recht, das lassen wir mal beiseite, weil das hat ja keinen Wert mehr. Und die Israelis, die morden fröhlich weiter im Libanon, in Gaza und in der Westbank. Also der Einfluss, um auf die Frage zurückzukommen, der Einfluss von Netanyahu ist sehr groß auf Trump. Das hat verschiedenste Gründe. Das hat der politische Einfluss der Israel-Lobby in Amerika ist gigantisch. Aber, und hier möchte ich ein großes, heißt immer, dass die Israelis die gesamte Strategie der Amerikaner kontrollieren und koordinieren.
We need to add a footnote here.
Hier eine Fußnote anhängen. Das Ziel der Israelis ist
The goal of the Israelis is Greater Israel. You could already read that in Ben-Gurion's diary back in the 1940s. At the time, it was dismissed as a conspiracy theory. But today, every Israeli soldier has a patch showing a map of Greater Israel. That includes Egypt up to and including the Suez Canal. It includes Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, large parts of Syria, along with parts of Saudi Arabia and Iraq. And especially the Saudis should start thinking carefully about which side they're on, because they're on the menu.
Auf welcher Seite sie stehen, weil sie auf dem Menüplan stehen. Und die Strategie von Netanyahu.
And Netanyahu's strategy, he's been doing this for 25 years, is to keep saying that the Iranians are just 2 weeks away from having a nuclear bomb, which is complete nonsense. But he needs to destroy or neutralize Iran in order to push through his Greater Israel plan. The Americans, though, have different plans. For the United States, the main enemy is China, because as a hegemon, they believe China either wants to become or will become the next hegemon, and they don't understand multipolarity. So the goal is to weaken China, and with it, Russia, because that partnership really doesn't sit well with the Americans. The ultimate target would then be China, and Iran is an extremely important partner for both China and Russia.
Von China und Russland. Von China bezüglich Energielieferungen.
From China, it's about energy supplies. And from China and Russia together, it's about infrastructure and transport routes. The North-South corridor, which ultimately connects Russia with India by land, and the East-West corridor from the Belt and Road Initiative. That railway already exists. It would be a disaster for Russia and for China if this country were destroyed, neutralized, or Americanized. It's extremely important to understand that the Americans and the Israelis aren't as closely aligned as one might think. Their goals are currently the same when it comes to Iran, the destruction of Iran. But the ultimate objectives of these two countries are different, and very few people realize that. And that also explains the position of the Chinese and the Russians.
Der Chinesen und der Russen. Und es fand ein Telefongespräch statt.
There was a phone call between President Putin and President Trump. Ushakov, who's Putin's foreign policy advisor, gave a report on that call. And according to him, Putin clearly warned Trump not to continue attacking and said that any ground operation would be completely unacceptable. Putin couldn't have made his position any clearer. Completely unacceptable. When Putin says that to you, you should take it seriously. Whether it'll make any difference, we don't know. I spoke with Scott Ritter again yesterday, and I asked him, "What do you think now? Last time you were right." And Scott told me, "It's actually pretty simple. You can't expect me to judge a person who's completely irrational using rational arguments." And by that, he meant Trump.
Ich beurteile, der komplett irrational ist, und damit hat der Trump gemeint.
Aber die Motive, die dahinter liegen, sind nicht irrational.
But the motives behind it aren't irrational. It's obviously about transport routes, about connectivity, in other words, about cutting Beijing off from major trade arteries. It's also about supply, about oil. It's partly about cutting Beijing off from oil as well. Around 20% of its oil needs come from Iran. Is it also about the dollar economy, about maintaining the dollar as the leading currency? And is it about propping up the house of cards in the derivatives market with new resources? We need to break that down step by step.
Das müssen wir portionieren. Also erstens, jetzt kommen ein paar Fakten zuerst, dass man.
First of all, let's start with a few facts. The Americans really do want to cut off China's access to energy for strategic reasons. China used to get a lot of oil from Venezuela, and the Americans managed to block that successfully. The second point is the Strait of Hormuz. That route could be cut off as well, no matter what happens next in the Middle East. And the next hotspot will be the Strait of Malacca, because I believe about 70 or 80% of all goods going to or coming from China pass through there. And the Americans will do everything they can to weaken China at that point.
That means they need another regional conflict.
Yes, and now they're negotiating with Indonesia. So this is going to continue. About a year ago, I wrote a series called The War of Two Worlds Has Already Begun, and in it, I described exactly this, that even if there isn't a world war, and of course you can argue about what that term really means, I assume that America isn't looking for a direct military conflict with China or Russia, but it is engaging in proxy wars, or wars against those actors across different regions. And now Iran is the first example of that. We can talk about the Second or the Third World War later.
Was die Leute nicht wissen, die meisten Leute nicht wissen, ist, dass China bereits.
What most people don't realize is that China is already about 85% energy independent and has by far the largest oil and gas reserves stored up, so they can hold out the longest. The Chinese are in a very, very strong position, especially compared to Europe and Southeast Asia, which are in a catastrophic situation. It doesn't matter at all. They could reopen the Strait of Hormuz today. Around 1.2 or 1.3 billion barrels have been lost. And the impact and the consequences of this energy crisis are now rolling toward Europe like a tsunami. There's no way to change that. By the end of May at the latest, we'll be facing the problem of energy sources in Europe, not just as a question of price, but of availability.
Des Preises, sondern der Erhältlichkeit in Europa. Dazu kommt, dass
on top of that, the materials needed to produce fertilizer, about 35% of the world's supply, are affected. That means if you look at poorer countries, they basically have no fertilizer left. We'll start seeing the consequences early next year, and that's going to lead to famines. And the third point is helium. I believe around 30 to 35% of the world's helium production passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Helium is essential for the chip industry, so that issue is basically settled too. I have to say, I'm pretty much speechless that even the Financial Times, which presents itself as a business newspaper, is taking this rather lightly. And then on top of all that, you mentioned derivatives. We've got the Brent price and the WTI price.
Den WTI-Preis, der WTI, West Texas Intermediate, das ist das amerikanische
West Texas Intermediate. That's the American oil. These are simply different types of crude. There are about 150 different kinds of oil. We tend to think there are just two, but in fact, there are around 150. And the prices right now are, well, I'm not sure I'm completely up to date, somewhere between WTI at about 100 and Brent at around 110. But those are futures. That means you can have the right to buy. If you actually want to buy physical oil, say from Russia, that's around 125.
Das liegt bei etwa 125 und im Nahen Osten ist zwischen 140 und
And in the Middle East, it's between $140 and $170. So if you bring your tanker there and say, fill it up, prices are 30 to 35% higher if you even make it there at all. And whether the Strait of Hormuz is open or not, since February 28th, the amount getting through has dropped by 19 to 95%. That's an absolute disaster, and I'm speechless at the fact that, especially in Europe, where people read a lot of newspapers, everyone seems completely relaxed. And I mean, the biggest concern I see in the Swiss papers is whether summer vacations will get more expensive and airline tickets will go up. Those are the kinds of topics people in Europe are talking about.
Die in Europa geführt werden.
US-Präsident Richard Nixon
U.S. President Richard Nixon came up with a trick to cover the enormous costs and debts of the Vietnam War. He ended the dollars linked to gold and tied it instead to the oil trade. I think that's fair to say. And it's hard not to notice that the United States and the West tend to go after countries that no longer want to sell their oil in dollars. Libya, Syria, Iraq, Venezuela, and increasingly the Iranians as well. Is there a strategy behind that?
Haben das zunehmend nicht getan. Steckt da eine Strategie dahinter?
Also, da steckte eine
So there was a strategy behind that. After the collapse of the gold dollar, after the closing of the gold window, Well, it wasn't really a closing of the gold window. It was a clear breach of contract. Under Bretton Woods, the Americans had guaranteed the 43 participating countries that for 35 paper dollars, they'd get 1 ounce of gold. They said, you can keep the paper, the gold stays with us. That was a default. That was on August 15th, 1971. And then the brilliant Richard Nixon first made a deal with the Saudis, saying, we'll protect you, and you'll sell your oil only in US dollars.
Ihr verkauft euer Öl nur noch im US-Dollar. Das war der Deal und damit war der Petrodollar.
That was the deal, and that's how the petrodollar was born. That had, if I can explain it briefly, a very specific meaning. The result was that practically all trade, not just in oil, but in all raw materials, was conducted in dollars. That meant every central bank in the world had to hold dollars in order to pay their bills. So, for example, if a company in Switzerland buys oil, the bank has to provide dollars, which are then held by the respective central bank. And those dollars aren't held in cash or physical US currency. People thought, well, I'd like to earn some interest on that, so they bought bonds instead.
Also kaufe ich Obligationen. Und somit war die ganze Welt dazu.
And so the whole world was forced to buy American bonds. That meant the Americans could automatically refinance themselves because everyone needed them. Since it's always about supply and demand, US interest rates stayed very low, even as their debt kept growing. So, it was a great deal for the Americans. Everyone held dollars, and they could print as much as they wanted. And that's exactly what they did. Then came the punitive actions. Just briefly, there were 2 major ones. The first was Saddam Hussein. All that talk about weapons of mass destruction, just nonsense.
Das alles blödes Zeugs. Saddam Hussein hat Öl verkauft.
Saddam Hussein sold oil in euros, and then he was attacked, and the country was destroyed. After that, everything was switched back to dollars. The second case was Libya, under Gaddafi. He wanted to introduce the gold dinar, and he was eliminated too, to maintain that balance and the dominance of the petrodollar. The Americans made a fatal mistake, together, of course, with their loyal European partners, when they froze Russia's central bank reserves in March 2022, and even partly seized them. That sent a strong signal to many other countries, including China, which at the time was the largest investor in US government bonds.
Investoren in amerikanischen Staatspapieren waren. Haben wir gedacht, ja, das kann uns ja auch passieren.
We thought, well, that could happen to us too. And that's when a trend began. A lot of countries started selling dollars, meaning US government bonds, and investing heavily in gold instead. That's one of the main reasons the price of gold has gone up. And the situation keeps getting worse, because Iran, for example, will be very careful not to sell anything in dollars. If they make a payment in dollars, it always goes through the United States, and then Washington can say, Mr. Baab, we don't like that. We'll take the money, sanction it, and freeze it.
Und sanktionieren es und frieren es ein. Das heißt, die Iraner.
That means the Iranians. Their transactions are done in yuan, in rial, and in gold. So the whole world is starting to move away from those currencies that are dangerous. And the dangerous one is the US dollar. And of course the euro as well, because the euro can also be frozen by that nice lady in Brussels. And that's a disastrous trend for the Americans. They have the largest debt in the world. Up until this year, the US spent more money on interest payments than on the military. That's now been corrected, with President Trump raising the military budget from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion, while interest payments are around 1.2 to 1.25 trillion.
1,25 Billionen.
Der Finanzanalyst Alex Kreiner.
Financial analyst Alex Kreiner also traces the war with Iran back to the financial sector, especially to the dominance of finance over the real economy. He says the speculative bubble in warrants, derivatives, and stock market bets, as you could call them, now exceeds the real value created by roughly a factor of 10. Because of that, banks constantly need new resources to cover old, bad market speculations, and they push governments into war. He says all wars are bankers' wars. Is that true? Yes, absolutely. Even in the case of Iran?
Ja, Auf jeden Fall.
Auch am Beispiel Iran?
Ja, auch. Auch. Also es ist ja immer so.
Yes, that too.
Ein hervorragendes Geschäft.
It's always been the case that war is an excellent business, just for a few. The first family that really turned it into an institution was the Rothschild family. So you can make a lot of money from war. The arms industry in the United States is booming, and Kreiner already said that you need collateral for new loans. He explained that in great detail, using Venezuela as an example a few months ago. And the problem is this. In Venezuela now, I don't know if the CEO of Exxon has changed his mind. He said that this country isn't investable in its current form, in its current situation.
In der heutigen Form, in der heutigen Situation. Also das große Geschrei von
So all that loud talk from Trump about what a great deal it was, well, that hasn't even been implemented yet. And honestly, it's completely up in the air whether it'll turn out to be a success for the Americans. But I assume, as I said earlier, that the reason for attacking Iran is, of course, Americans always think they can just march in anywhere, and then they regularly steal the gold, steal the oil, control it, and get rich from it. But over the past 25 years, they've had to settle for simply destroying those countries. The strategic goal for the Americans is to weaken China and the China-Russia alliance.
ist die Schwächung China und China-Russland.
Jetzt haben sich die Amerikaner, wie Sie sagen, verschätzt.
Now the Americans, as they themselves admit, miscalculated. The course of the war shows that clearly. And the Iranians reopened the Strait of Hormuz for one day, giving the Americans a geopolitical window to pull back. Washington didn't take that opportunity. Instead, it responded with a naval blockade of its own. Is that naval blockade having any effect?
Wirkt diese Seeblockade?
Nein, das sind Papiertiger.
No, those are paper tigers. According to Larry Johnson, the Americans have about 12 ships available for the entire blockade, and they have to keep them at least 300 kilometers apart, otherwise they'll get shot down. Based on Larry Johnson's estimates, and I'm not a military expert, I'm relying on his numbers, the Americans are capable of intercepting maybe 5 to 10% of the ships. So calling something a blockade when 90% of it doesn't work is just marketing.
Nicht funktioniert, eine Blockade zu nennen, ist Marketing.
Es funktioniert also nicht.
Nein.
So it's not working, no. Does the blockade give Iran any advantages? Is Iran holding the cards here?
Also die amerikanische Blockade, die ist störend zu 5%.
So, the American blockade is only a nuisance, maybe 5 or 10%. But the Iranians have never actually blocked the Strait of Hormuz. They just don't let their enemies through. It's pretty simple. So Israelis can't pass, Americans can't pass. The Spaniards, for example, Sanchez has behaved heroically toward Israel and toward the United States. And they said, sure, that's no problem. That's how it can work. The Japanese can pass too. Most others have to pay a fee of about $2 million per ship as a toll, just like in Panama or the Suez Canal. And the fact that the Iranians haven't done that until now and are introducing it only now doesn't make it illegal.
Die Iraner bis jetzt nicht gemacht haben und jetzt einführen, macht das ja nicht illegal. Ich würde das auch machen. Und die Omanis dürfen sich freuen.
I'd do the same. And the Omanis can be happy about it. There's going to be a fee-sharing agreement, so they'll make a substantial amount of money from it. I really can't imagine how the U.S. could solve this militarily. I think it'll be relatively easy for the Iranians to enforce. I've heard that now the Russians have to pay their share, right? I'll buy you dinner. And they get to let their tankers pass through for free. So that gives them a real instrument of power.
Hat man ein Machtmittel in der Hand?
Daraus erwächst ja die Frage, spielt der
That naturally raises the question, does the war in Iran play into Moscow's hands? Oh, that's a tough one.
Bezüglich Ölpreis, die
Regarding the price of oil, the Russians are among the winners right now because the price of oil has doubled. In the short and medium term, that's certainly good for a Russian budget strained by the costs of war. But President Putin and I spoke with Mironov about 2 weeks ago, and this is not a sustainable advantage. From a military perspective, there's another point. Weapons deliveries to Ukraine have, of course, dropped sharply. That's a military advantage. The Russians, naturally, push back against the idea that a war against a partner and friend could bring them any benefit. Culturally, in Russia, you simply won't hear that said. Financially, in the short term, if you just look at it on a spreadsheet, it's an advantage. But on the other hand, the Russians now face a question that isn't often discussed openly here in Russia. To what extent is Russia providing military and logistical support to Iran?
Den Iran militärisch-logistisch unterstützt.
And I assume that the support is substantial. How far it actually goes, I don't know, because no one talks about it. That's typically Russian, and in my view, that's the right approach. But it also ties up resources. It ties up military management capacity. You can hear and see many Russian transport planes flying to Tehran. That ties up resources too. So it's very, very hard to say. In the short term, maybe yes, but the aggression of the United States, which is clearly directed against Russia now in Ukraine, and also against Russia in Iran and against China, will lead to major expenditures, both financially in China and in Russia as well.
Is there an internal connection, a substantial link, between the war against Iran and the war in Ukraine?
Ja, sicher, ja. Das ist
Yes, of course. This is a forever war. The whole point is to destabilize. That's been American foreign policy, at least since 1945, to destabilize. I mean, it's obvious that the Americans know the Russians will prevail in Ukraine. We could spend another 2 hours talking about why it's taking so long. But it ties up resources, it brings death and destruction, and it weakens Russia overall. Because Russia would much rather spend that money on infrastructure than on war. That was really interesting.
Das war hochinteressant. Ich glaube, das war im Januar 2023, wenn ich mich richtig.
I think that was in January 2023, if I remember correctly. Kiselev interviewed President Putin, and about 70% of the time was spent talking about infrastructure projects in Russia. Moscow and the major cities in Russia are in excellent condition, especially compared to any European city. But this huge country still needs decades of investment in infrastructure. And really, it's a tragedy for Russia that so much money, so many resources, and so much management time, so much leadership capacity are being spent on the war instead of on infrastructure projects. And that makes one thing clear. For the Americans, it's only about destabilizing others, no matter who the opponent is, because the Americans simply aren't able to compete with the rest of the world.
In einem Wettbewerb zu bestehen gegenüber dem Rest der Welt.
Also die russische Föderation bedarf eigentlich.
Well, the Russian Federation actually needs infrastructure investment, especially because of how vast the country is, particularly in the rural areas and in Siberia. The Chinese are working on long-term projects like the concept of the new Silk Road. Are the Americans trying to counter that with a strategy of deliberate chaos? Yes, in one word, yes.
Mit einem Wort beantwortet ja.
Was bedeutet das für die Europäer?
What does that mean for Europeans? Well, I think Europeans have made just about every mistake you can imagine. We can talk about Germany. I don't even know how many years it's been since Germany was the world's top exporter. They had a bigger export industry than China. If you tell someone that today, nobody believes it. And the main reason, aside from the fact that they're hardworking and smart people, one of the main reasons was their extremely cheap energy. And now you can see that energy in Germany costs about 5 times as much. It's being bought from other countries, like India, which in turn gets its energy from Russia.
Die Energie von Russland beziehen und die Inder sind gute Geschäftsleute, die haben dann.
And the Indians are good business people. They add quite a bit on top, and then the foolish Germans buy it from them. And they buy it from the Americans too. Energy costs are about 5 times higher. A lot of people don't believe that because the German government subsidizes energy prices. So the scale of this disaster is being hidden and covered up. Then Germany, or Europe, you can pretty much lump them together at this point, well, they first declared Russia the big enemy. It's not the first time, and the last time, that didn't turn out very well, at least militarily. But that doesn't stop Mr. Mers. I've seen him show up wearing a military jacket.
In einer Militärjacke auftreten gesehen. Ich weiß nicht, ob's AI war, was weiß man heute nicht, aber
I don't know if it was AI, who really knows these days, but I thought, I must be seeing things. That was the first mistake. And then they even went and told the Chinese about it. And now good old Merds, this was last week, on February 29th, said what the Americans are doing with Iran is great. We fully support it. And now he's realizing that it's not turning out well. So now Mers is saying the Americans don't have any strategy there, that it's not going to end well. They've even managed to anger the Americans. Yeah, it's getting tricky.
Ja, es wird langsam schwierig. Die Europa und Deutschland speziell, die seit 2000
Europe and Germany in particular, which since 2022 have been saying how isolated Russia is in the world, now really need to start looking for friends. Because the situation in Europe itself, Europe isn't united. And the latest, and actually the best example, is Spain. Because Sanchez had the courage to denounce the genocide and to condemn the war of aggression by the Americans and Israelis against Iran. So and that's not in the East, that's in the southwest of Europe. If you look at the streets, if you look at the demonstrations across Europe, that's something you don't see in the Western media. But sympathy for Iran keeps growing, and so does sympathy for the Palestinians, whatever name you want to give it.
Für den Iran steigen und für die Palästinenser so oder so. Dann die Wahlen in
Then there were the elections in Hungary. At first glance, they seemed to go just the way Mrs. von der Leyen would have liked. But the new strongman clearly has his own ideas, and he's not about to sell his soul to Brussels. And then we have Romania. Wait, was it Romania or Bulgaria? Sorry, I can't remember. Right, it was Bulgaria, where the elections turned out differently. What we're seeing is a slow kind of decay, a gradual disintegration. The unity of Europe just isn't working anymore. And now the financial situation is a disaster. On top of that, the energy situation is going to get worse. I see a very dark future for Europe, because in this big game being played by the major powers, the United States, China, Russia, and now, as a fourth power, we have to get used to the fact that Iran is part of it. Europe simply doesn't matter. And what doesn't matter doesn't get funded.
Und was nicht wichtig ist, wird nicht finanziert.
Sind die europäischen Führer, Starmer,
Are the European leaders, Starmer, Macron, Merz, maybe even Scholz, who have led Western Europe ever deeper into the war in Ukraine, ever closer to the brink of bankruptcy, simply too small-minded to handle this global political situation? That's a tough question because can you really answer it with just yes or no?
kann man mit Ja oder Nein beantworten.
Well, if I were being cynical, I'd say they just don't care.
So are they morally finished?
Sie fliegen Privatjet.
They fly on private jets, stay in five-star hotels, get paid well, and probably have a little stash tucked away offshore somewhere.
In einer Offshore.
A morally corrupt elite. Completely yes.
Ja. Also diese Personen.
So, these people don't represent their country's interests in any way. Whose interests do they represent then? Their own. Which means they've been bought, corrupted, maybe even blackmailed, and now they serve the interests of Brussels and the United States.
Und der Vereinigten Staaten.
Stehen wir auch.
Are we for that reason at the beginning of a new century of wars?
Ja, ich gehe davon aus, dass diese
Yes, I assume that this warlike phase, the end of it, well, you and I won't live to see that. It's going to take decades.
Das wird Jahrzehnte dauern.
Ein Untergehen des Imperiums.
A collapsing empire. The United States is lashing out. Or how should I interpret that? Yes, that's a very good interpretation. Is there still hope? Or do we have to say, like Dante's traveler in the Divine Comedy, whoever passes through this gate, abandon all hope?
Dieses Tor tritt, lasse alle Hoffnung fahren.
Also die Hoffnung stirbt zuletzt.
Well, hope dies last. I mean, this is basically all I deal with these days. I'm actually taking a few days off now, turning off the internet and reading only books that have nothing to do with geopolitics. At this point, I think things have taken on a life of their own. Even the smartest and most experienced experts I know no longer have any idea what's going to happen tomorrow or the day after. We've reached a point where, well, my latest article is really more of a description than an analysis. You can't even write an analysis anymore that says, this is what's going to happen next. A year ago, I still could, back when I saw this catastrophe coming. But you know, there are always surprises. And it's okay if, once in a while, it's actually a positive one. Maybe here in Europe, since we're speaking to a European audience, maybe Sanchez was the first. And maybe there are forces in Europe where more people will stand up and say, all right, dear Ursula, Mr. Merz, and the rest of you, goodbye, you can leave, or head to jail. That's possible too. We don't always have to look at everything negatively. Things can move quickly. So yes, Sanchez was a surprise. I was completely surprised, pleasantly surprised, and that can create a positive momentum. I mean, honestly, I'd be deeply depressed if I, Kaling,
Also ich hätte ja schwerste Depressionen, wenn ich nur schwarz sehen würde.
If I were only seeing things in black, I'd say this. Israel and the United States have lost the war against Iran, a war they themselves started. The United States, a declining empire, is lashing out. We're living in a century of new wars, but there are always surprises, and sometimes history turns out differently than we imagined. Many thanks to geopolitical analyst and editor of the forum Geopolitical, Peter Hänseler. Here at Against the Current, we present viewpoints and analyses that the propaganda media choose to hide.
Welche die Propagandamedien verschweigen.